Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, season's greetings, whatever Buddhists say. My heartfelt wishes of wellness to all of our audience, wherever they are, whoever they may be, which creed they may represent. This is Atilla Yeşilada, presenting another Real Turkey episode. We're talking about forecasts for Turkey in 2020. Politics is the main concern today. And in 2020, this humble person predicts early elections simply because the President Erdogan's government has not been able to resuscitate economic growth. We just got the IMF forecasts in the scope of the Article 4 consultations, and IMF expects 3% growth. My personal expectation is 2%, but hey, what's 1% between friends? IMF also expects roughly 13% inflation and 13.5% unemployment. These are not the numbers that would allow the Erdogan administration to survive 2020. Also, there are several geopolitical risks which I have mentioned or will have mentioned in a nearby video somewhere in the general vicinity called Santa Brings New Problems for Turkey. You may wish to check that to see how I abuse the English language. American sanctions, the problems in Syria, in the safe zone, and now in Idlib, the war in Libya, where we suddenly found ourselves involved because we promised to send military aid, etc. All of these could cause currency or interest rate shocks and the very weak economic recovery. So I can't guarantee it because Mr. Erdogan has a knack for suddenly becoming extremely pragmatic, as he has done in the past. For instance, he released an American pastor, Father Andrew Jansen. After downing a Russian plane, he made peace with Russia when he realized that Russian economic sanctions were squeezing the life out of Turkish economy. So again, when he realizes that the economic recovery is not sustainable and that he has taken too much on his plate in terms of diplomatic difficulties, he may completely change course, and we may see a completely different policy platform in the new year. But in the absence of that, early elections are a significant problem. Finally, there are several polls as well as anecdotal evidence that AKP is crumbling. It's not necessarily splintering, but crumbling. Two new parties are being formed by Professor and former PM Ahmet Davutoğlu, which has already been established, and former economy czar, Mr. Ali Babacan, has declared on TV that his party will be ready at the turn of the year. It is difficult to say how many votes these parties will get, but my humble investigation based on several polls is that each will command at least 5% of the vote, most of which coming from AKP. So they will sort of play a tiebreaker role if there is an early election. But I want to focus on the presidential elections because of the complicated rules governing Turkish elections. If there is a parliamentary election, there also has to be a presidential election. And the presidency runs Turkey. We're on some sort of bizarre presidential system. This means Mr. Erdogan will also be up for re-election. And even though no one has already declared his or her candidacy, because there are no elections scheduled in 2020, the most likely rival to Mr. Erdogan is Istanbul Mayor, Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu, who is a member of the main opposition party, the CHP, or National Republican Party. And I think a question in the minds of foreign observers of Turkey and many Turks is whether Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu can best Mr. Erdogan or give him a run for his money. So let's get to know Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu, because even though he is at the very early stages of his national political career, one may draw some resemblances to the early days of Mr. Erdogan, who came from nowhere to become the mayor of Istanbul overnight. Ekrem Imamoglu was really an unknown quantity up until the turn of the last year, when CHP chairman Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu appointed him or nominated him as the candidate for Istanbul mayor. Until then, he was a borough mayor in Istanbul, and no one has heard of him. Mr. Imamoglu staged and managed an excellent campaign, even though he didn't have enough funds as much as his rival, Mr. Binali Yildirim of AKP, or any access to mainstream media. He very astutely used alternative media, that's social media, and his live appearances in election rallies to steal the hearts of the people, and he beat AKP not only once but twice. The first Istanbul election was cancelled by the High Election Council. In the second one, he won by a landslide, and Mr. Erdogan had to accept defeat. There are 3 polls ranking major city mayors. In all 3 of them, he is either the most popular mayor of Turkey, or he has raised his popularity rating since his election as the mayor of Istanbul. He may at this point command a 60% popularity rating in Istanbul, which is not a mean feat. Another thing that propelled him to the national stage is Canal Istanbul, which is sort of like the Panama Canal, but it will link Black Sea to Marmara Sea, which is apparently deeply detested by the citizens of Istanbul, according to the only poll we have by Artı Bir, which means +1 TV channel, which reveals that 72% of the participants in the poll don't want Canal Istanbul, but Erdogan is committed to building Canal Istanbul. So by leading the resistance to Canal Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu is also directly facing Mr. Erdogan and has found himself at the national stage in some sort of Shakespearean battle against Mr. Erdogan, or it's Ekrem Imamoglu versus the Goliath. Does he have any chances of beating him? I think he may have an even chance of beating Mr. Erdogan, who is really losing popularity, as indicated by the 2 new parties that split from AKP. But there are certain caveats. A, remember, Mr. Erdogan made his way to the party chairmanship by demonstrating excellent managerial skills in Istanbul. Let's face it, I'm not a fan of Erdogan, but prior to him, Istanbul was a mess. I mean, garbage wasn't collected. There were fires, in garbage dumps. He has set this straight. Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu has to achieve that. He has to prove to this nation that he is a skillful administrator worthy of their vote, because he's going to run the nation. And that's not an easy task, simply because a good portion of the city budget comes from Ankara, and Mr. Erdogan controls this budget. Another portion comes from state banks as loans, and Mr. Imamoglu says that state banks are no longer lending to his municipality. In short, Mr. Imamoglu is operating under a fiscal constraint that previous AKP mayors have never experienced. He needs to deliver the welfare services and the public services that Istanbul citizens are used to over very harsh winter months successfully without interruption to retain his popularity. He also has to deal with a hostile city assembly where the majority is AKP and MHP members. I am unable to predict whether he can do those things, but so far he has dealt very skillfully with the absence of major funding by cutting expenditures and reducing city debt levels and borrowing some amount of money from abroad. If he survives the winter with his popularity intact, and if he manages to beat back Mr. Erdogan in the Canal Istanbul confrontation, which I think he has a very fair chance of doing so, because Canal Istanbul, besides being very unpopular, is also extremely costly, and no matter how you look at it, not very profitable. So I don't know if anybody would be interested in building it. Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu will have a very good chance of having a successful race against Erdogan, which would have very significant implications for Turkish economy and markets. Assuming there is an early election, let's say in the second half of 2020, the fact that in the polls, Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu is pulling close to Erdogan is a major uncertainty for the markets. And of course, it would compel Mr. Erdogan to populism, which means more budgetary spending, perhaps interest rates lower than foreign or Turkish investors would accept, and more volatility in Turkish currency and bond markets. I wish both of them well if there is a contest between them, but Ekrem Imamoglu rising to prominence and given good contest to Mr. Erdogan is actually cause for extreme volatility in Turkish financial markets and potentially for the economy in 2020. This was our final broadcast for 2019. I want to thank you, all of our audience, subscribers, and those who have honored us with their comments and criticism. We hope to be with you in the new year with better programs, better English, and more guests. Once again, Happy New Year. This is Atilla Yeşilada presenting for Real Turkey channel.